Clementine's world was simple and harsh. Born to a family that had long since forgotten the warmth of love, she grew up in a small, dilapidated house on the edge of a nameless town. Her days were filled with the burden of survival, often under the cold gaze of those meant to care for her. But even in such darkness, Clementine shone with a quiet dignity that couldn't be easily crushed. Her family, however, was far from nurturing. Each member seemed to embody the very trials life had thrown at her, personified in the people closest to her. Her father, Raymond, was a man of bitter ambition. Once full of dreams and hope, he had been beaten down by life's misfortunes. His graying hair and sunken eyes spoke of a lifetime spent working jobs that never paid enough, battling endless debts, and enduring a marriage that brought him no joy. He blamed his lot in life on everyone but himself. His anger was palpable, a force that darkened every room he entered. He reserved a special disdain for Clementine, the daughter who had never been the son he wanted. Raymond's cruelty was subtle. He didn't beat Clementine, but his words sliced deeper than any physical blow ever could. Every mistake she made was a sign of her incompetence. Every success was ignored or attributed to someone else. Clementine became accustomed to his remarks, the way his voice dripped with disdain whenever he spoke to her. It was as though, in his eyes, she was a constant reminder of his own failures. Her mother, Estelle, was no better. She had long ago given up on life, resigning herself to the role of a housewife in a crumbling home, but without any of the tenderness or care that often comes with the title. Estelle's face was lined with exhaustion, her eyes void of the love or warmth a mother should have. She, too, was bitter, though in a quieter way. Unlike Raymond, Estelle's cruelty was wrapped in apathy. She didn't yell or berate Clementine. She simply ignored her. Estelle had grown up in a similar household, passed from one form of neglect to another. She had married Raymond, thinking it would provide an escape from her loveless home, only to find herself trapped in an even colder environment. Her resignation to her fate left no room for affection, not even for her children. Clementine was just another chore to be managed, another disappointment in a long line of them. Then there were Clementine's siblings, each a reflection of the house's misery, yet with their own distinct flavors of cruelty. Griselda, the eldest, was the spitting image of her father in both looks and temperament. She had a sharp, angular face and eyes that gleamed with malice whenever she looked at Clementine. Griselda was everything Clementine wasn't: confident, commanding, and vicious. From a young age, she had learned how to manipulate people, bending others to her will, especially their parents. To them, Griselda was a golden child, the one who would carry the family forward. Griselda's cruelty toward Clementine was more blatant than their father's. She loved to point out Clementine's flaws, real or imagined, in front of their parents. Every mistake Clementine made was magnified 1,000-fold. Every small victory Griselda claimed as her own. She reveled in making Clementine feel small and worthless, a hobby she never grew tired of. Then there was Lucas, the middle child, who had learned from Griselda but lacked her charm. Where Griselda could turn cruelty into an art form, Lucas was blunt and straightforward in his disdain. He didn't care much for words, preferring to show his hatred through action. A shove in a hallway, a cruel prank meant to embarrass Clementine in front of others. His torment was physical, but just as damaging. Lucas had dropped out of school early, deciding that life was easier when you stopped trying. He worked odd jobs around town, enough to earn pocket money, but never enough to leave the family home. His jealousy toward Clementine was palpable. In some ways, Lucas saw her quiet determination as an affront to his own lazy existence. The fact that she still tried, despite everything, infuriated him. He was a storm, unpredictable in his anger, and always ready to lash out. Lastly, there was little Betty, the youngest of the siblings. Unlike the others, Betty was too young to truly grasp the cruelty that permeated their household, but she was already being shaped by it. At 7 years old, Betty had already learned to mirror the behaviors of Griselda and Lucas, picking up on the way they treated Clementine. Betty would mimic their words, repeating their insults with the innocence of a child who doesn't yet understand the weight of her actions. But there was something in Betty's eyes, something distant and cold, that told Clementine her youngest sibling would grow up to be just like the others. Clementine's days were spent in the shadows of her family's cruelty. She never knew warmth from any of them. When she wasn't being criticized, she was ignored. Meals were eaten in silence, with Raymond occasionally tossing a cruel remark her way. Griselda would smirk, Lucas would sneer, and Betty would watch with curious eyes, learning how to become another weapon in the family's arsenal. But despite the constant barrage of disdain, Clementine never let it break her spirit. She endured, though her endurance was not without cost. She learned to expect nothing, to keep her head down, and to avoid conflict whenever possible. Yet, inside her, there burned a quiet flame of defiance. She wouldn't let them win, not completely. She wouldn't allow herself to be swallowed by the misery that had consumed them. Clementine's few moments of peace came when she was alone, usually walking through the overgrown fields near their home. Here, she could dream of a better life, even if it felt distant and impossible. She would imagine herself far from this place, in a world where people didn't look at her with disgust or disappointment. She dreamed of kindness, of love, things that had always been absent from her life. She found solace in books, borrowed from the town library, when she could manage to slip away unnoticed. The stories within those pages transported her to worlds where hope was not a foreign concept, where people fought for better lives and sometimes even found happiness. These stories gave her strength, though she never admitted it to herself. Life outside the family wasn't much kinder. The town where she lived was small, and gossip traveled fast. People knew the type of family Clementine came from, and by association, they looked down on her. She had no friends, no allies to confide in. The other girls her age avoided her, some out of pity, others out of disdain. Clementine had always been that girl, the one from the broken home, the one with the angry father and indifferent mother. It was easier to ignore her than to try and understand her. School had been a battleground for her. Teachers barely noticed her, and students made a sport of teasing her. Clementine had learned to sit at the back of the classroom, quiet and unnoticed. She didn't raise her hand or ask questions, knowing that drawing attention to herself only invited more cruelty. Her classmates, much like her family, seemed to sense her vulnerability and took pleasure in exploiting it. Clementine worked odd jobs around town once she finished school, doing whatever she could to bring in a little money for herself. Cleaning houses, working in the local bakery, even mending clothes for people too lazy or busy to do it themselves. The pay was always meager, but it was hers, and that small sliver of independence was enough to keep her going. Her hands were always tired, her back always aching. Yet, in her heart, she knew this was better than being trapped at home all day under the oppressive presence of her family. These jobs, menial as they were, allowed her brief moments of escape. They gave her a glimpse of the world beyond her small, suffocating life. Still, every time she earned a little more, every time she dared to dream of saving enough to leave, something would happen to pull her back. Raymond would demand money to pay some overdue bill. Griselda would borrow what little Clementine had saved. Lucas would need bailing out after some stupid altercation. And Betty, well, Betty was still young, but Clementine could see the beginnings of similar patterns. The weight of it all was enough to make most people crumble. But Clementine wasn't like most people. She had learned to carry her burdens silently, without complaint. She knew there was something out there for her, something beyond the smallness of her life. And she wasn't going to let the bitterness of her family poison her soul. Clementine's life continued in the slow, suffocating rhythm of routine. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, with little variation. Each morning, she would wake up before the sun, quietly slipping out of bed to start her day before her family stirred. Her body moved with mechanical precision, cooking, cleaning, and preparing to step into the world that treated her as an invisible presence. She had learned to live in the shadows, where expectations were minimal and confrontation was rare. It was easier to be unseen, unnoticed. But as much as Clementine tried to keep her head down, life had other plans. It was during one of her frequent trips to the bakery, where she worked cleaning up after the messes left by the staff and customers, that something began to shift. The bakery was a bustling place, filled with the scent of fresh bread and pastries. The warmth of the ovens and the cheerful chatter of the townspeople stood in sharp contrast to the cold emptiness of Clementine's home. It was here that she felt a sense of belonging, even if no one paid her much attention. Clementine was content to be a silent observer, finding solace in the simplicity of her tasks. The bakery's owner, Mrs. Edith Carson, was a plump, middle-aged woman with a soft spot for gossip and a keen eye for details. She was one of the few people in town who didn't treat Clementine with outright disdain, though their relationship was far from close. Mrs. Carson often prattled on about the goings-on in town, her words filling the empty space between them as Clementine scrubbed floors or polished the wooden counters. It was on one such day that Mrs. Carson's gossip caught Clementine's attention in a way it never had before. "Did you hear, dear?" Mrs. Carson asked, her voice tinged with excitement. "There's a grand event coming up, a charity gala of sorts, right in the heart of town. I hear all the important people will be there, businessmen, politicians, you know the type. Fancy folk with money to spare." She paused, wiping her flour-covered hands on her apron as she leaned in closer. "And guess what? There's going to be a contest, a raffle, I suppose you'd call it. The winner gets a chance to attend. Can you imagine? People like us, rubbing elbows with the wealthy?" Clementine barely looked up from her work, though Mrs. Carson's words had piqued her interest. She didn't belong in a world of wealth and luxury, nor did she particularly want to. The idea of attending a gala filled with the town's elite seemed so far beyond her reality that it was almost laughable. Still, something about the way Mrs. Carson spoke, the excitement in her voice, stirred a longing in Clementine she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. "Oh, I'm sure it'll be grand," Clementine murmured, her tone neutral. Mrs. Carson chuckled, misinterpreting Clementine's disinterest. "You're too young to be so serious all the time, Clementine. You should dream a little, girl. There's no harm in it. Who knows? Maybe something will come of it." Clementine forced a smile, but inside, a storm was quietly brewing. Dreaming was dangerous. She had learned that the hard way. Dreaming led to disappointment, and disappointment was something she had endured enough of in her lifetime. But even as she pushed the idea of the gala from her mind, a tiny spark of curiosity lingered, refusing to be snuffed out. Clementine returned home that evening to the familiar chaos of her family's dysfunction. Raymond was in one of his moods, his anger simmering just below the surface as he sat in his usual chair, staring at the television with a drink in hand. Estelle sat nearby, her expression blank as she scrolled through the pages of an old magazine, lost in a world of her own apathy. Griselda was nowhere to be seen, likely out with friends, flaunting her superiority over the rest of the town. Lucas was in the garage, tinkering with something that would inevitably break, leaving him frustrated and ready to lash out. Betty, on the other hand, was sitting at the kitchen table, her small hands folded in her lap as she waited for dinner. The child's eyes followed Clementine's every move as she entered the room, and for a moment Clementine felt a pang of something close to pity for her youngest sibling. Betty, though still young, was already absorbing the toxic atmosphere of the house. Clementine could see it in the way Betty mimicked Griselda's smug expressions, the way she parroted Lucas's disdain. "What are we having for dinner?" Betty asked, her tone laced with impatience, though it lacked the malice that Griselda or Lucas would have employed. "Soup," Clementine replied quietly, moving to the stove where a pot of broth simmered. She had learned long ago to make simple meals stretch, feeding the family on the meager resources they had. Her cooking was never praised, only expected, and often criticized if anything went wrong. Betty wrinkled her nose, but said nothing more. Clementine ladled out portions for the family, placing each bowl on the table with practiced efficiency. As usual, no one offered thanks. It was during dinner that the conversation turned to the upcoming gala. Griselda, who had returned just in time for the meal, had apparently heard the same gossip as Mrs. Carson and was quick to share her excitement. "Did you hear about the gala?" Griselda asked, her voice dripping with smugness. "I've already entered the raffle. I'm sure I'll win, of course. It's not like anyone else in this town has the kind of charm or presence I do. Can you imagine me in a room full of millionaires and important people?" Raymond grunted, barely looking up from his meal. "It's a waste of time. Those kinds of events are for people with real money, not riffraff pretending to belong." Griselda rolled her eyes. "That's the point, Father. It's a chance to mingle with the right people, to make connections. You wouldn't understand." She shot a glance at Clementine, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Not that any of you would." Clementine kept her head down, her spoon moving mechanically as she ate. Griselda's words were nothing new. She had long since grown accustomed to being the target of her sister's condescension. But tonight, something felt different. The mention of the gala, the idea of a world beyond their small, miserable existence. It was stirring something in Clementine that she couldn't quite name. "Maybe I'll go, too," Lucas chimed in, though the way he said it made it clear he wasn't serious. "I'd love to watch all those rich idiots make fools of themselves." "Please," Griselda scoffed. "You'd stick out like a sore thumb." Lucas glared at her, but before he could retort, Raymond cut in. "Enough. None of you are going anywhere. Stop filling your heads with nonsense." The table fell silent, and the conversation shifted back to the usual mundane topics. But the seed had been planted, and as Clementine cleared the dishes later that night, she couldn't stop thinking about the gala, about the chance, however slim, to escape, even if just for one evening. The days leading up to the raffle passed in a blur of chores and work. Clementine's routine remained unchanged, but inside her, a quiet storm was brewing. She hadn't told anyone, not even Mrs. Carson, but she, too, had entered the raffle. It was an impulsive decision, made in a moment of defiance after overhearing another of Griselda's gloating rants. Clementine had been walking past the town hall when she saw the booth set up for raffle entries. Without thinking, she had walked up, filled out the form, and dropped it into the box. It was a small act, one that felt almost meaningless at the time, but it was hers. For once, she had done something for herself, something that had nothing to do with her family's demands or expectations. The odds of winning were slim, she knew that, but the simple act of entering felt like a rebellion against the life she had been forced into. As the day of the drawing approached, Clementine found herself thinking about the gala more often than she cared to admit. She imagined what it would be like to wear a beautiful gown, to walk into a room filled with people who didn't know her, who didn't see her as the poor, invisible girl from the outskirts of town. She imagined what it would be like to be someone else, if only for a night. It was a foolish dream. She knew that. But it was a dream nonetheless, and it was more than she had allowed herself to hope for in years. The day of the raffle arrived with little fanfare in Clementine's world. Her family went about their usual routines, oblivious to the fact that anything of importance might happen. Griselda had spent the morning boasting to anyone who would listen about how she was sure to win. Lucas, uninterested, had disappeared to do God knows what, while Raymond and Estelle barely seemed aware that the raffle was happening at all. Clementine, on the other hand, was filled with nervous anticipation. She had no reason to believe she would win, but the thought of it, the possibility, had been gnawing at her all week. She kept herself busy with chores, trying to push the thought from her mind, but it lingered, like an itch she couldn't quite scratch. Yet, for the first time in her life, Clementine found herself standing taller, her quiet determination hardening into something more resolute. This win, this unexpected twist in her fate, was hers alone. It wasn't something Griselda could steal or Lucas could sabotage. It was a glimmer of possibility in a world where hope had always been in short supply. Clementine's excitement for the gala grew slowly but surely. Every day brought her closer to the event, a night that would pull her, however briefly, into a world so far removed from her own. But even with the ticket secured, there was one glaring problem. She had nothing to wear. The charity gala was set to be an extravagant affair, a night of glitz and glamour, where the wealthy and powerful would gather to show off their fortunes while pretending to care about some worthy cause. Clementine knew she would stand out immediately if she showed up in her tattered work clothes. The thought made her stomach twist in knots. She had never cared much about appearances before, but now, as the night approached, the weight of societal judgment hung over her like a guillotine. It was Mrs. Carson who offered a solution, a kindness that Clementine hadn't expected. The plump baker, whose gossiping nature was softened by an undeniable warmth, had been bubbling with excitement since the day Clementine had won the raffle. "You can't go looking like that, dear," Mrs. Carson said one afternoon, her eyes darting over Clementine's plain dress and worn shoes. "No offense, of course, but these fancy folks, well, they're not like us. They'll eat you alive if you don't fit in, at least a little." She gave a conspiratorial wink. "I think I have just the thing." Without waiting for a reply, Mrs. Carson waddled to the back of the bakery, rummaging through a dusty old trunk that sat hidden behind the ovens. She returned a few minutes later, holding a deep emerald green gown that shimmered even in the dim light of the kitchen. "This belonged to my mother," Mrs. Carson explained, her tone uncharacteristically soft. "She was a real lady, back when our family still had some money. I've kept it all these years, but it doesn't fit me. Never did." She chuckled, patting her ample hips. "But I think it would look beautiful on you. What do you say?" Clementine stared at the dress, her heart pounding in her chest. It was beautiful, more beautiful than anything she had ever owned or even touched. The deep green fabric seemed to glow with its own inner light, the kind of gown that would turn heads in any room. It was more than just a dress. It was an invitation to a world she had never imagined herself a part of. "Mrs. Carson, I can't take this," Clementine stammered, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Nonsense," Mrs. Carson said, waving a hand dismissively. "I want you to have it. What good is it sitting in that old trunk, gathering dust? Besides, I think my mother would approve. She always said dresses like these deserved to be worn by people with kind hearts, not just full pockets." She smiled, her eyes twinkling with something close to affection. "Now, go on. Try it on. Let's see if it fits." Later that evening, back in the small, dimly lit room that Clementine called her own, she slipped into the emerald gown, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the fabric over her hips. The dress fit almost perfectly, the soft material hugging her slender frame in a way that felt both foreign and exhilarating. She turned to the small, cracked mirror that hung on her wall, her breath catching in her throat as she took in her reflection. She barely recognized herself. Gone was the girl who blended into the background, the invisible daughter and sister who moved through life unnoticed. In her place stood a woman, poised and graceful, her brown eyes wide with disbelief as she stared at the figure in the mirror. The dress transformed her, not just physically but emotionally. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she might truly belong at the gala, that she could, for one night, step out of the shadows and into the light. Of course, the illusion wasn't perfect. Her shoes were still worn, her hair still unkempt, and her skin bore the marks of a life spent working hard. But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. The dress was magic, a piece of another world draped over her tired shoulders, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Clementine felt beautiful. The feeling didn't last long. A sharp knock on her bedroom door jolted her out of her reverie, and before she could respond, the door swung open to reveal Griselda, her face twisted in a sneer. Well, Griselda drawled, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of Clementine in the emerald gown. "Isn't this a surprise? Playing dress-up, are we?" Clementine's heart sank. She had hoped to avoid her sister's scorn, but Griselda had a way of finding her in moments of vulnerability. Clementine quickly turned away from the mirror, pulling at the dress as if to hide it from view, but it was too late. Griselda had seen enough, and her smug expression told Clementine exactly what was coming. "You don't actually think you can pull this off, do you?" A dress like that doesn't change who you are, Clementine. You're still the same nobody you've always been. You might fool a few people for a night, but don't think for a second that you'll fit in with those high society types. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. Griselda had always known exactly how to strip her of her confidence, how to make her feel small and insignificant. "Face it," Griselda said, stepping closer and lowering her voice to a whisper. "You don't belong in that world, and you never will. You'll embarrass yourself, and us." With that, Griselda turned on her heel and left the room, leaving Clementine standing alone in front of the mirror, her heart heavy with doubt. The day of the gala arrived with an air of anticipation that clung to Clementine like a second skin. Despite Griselda's cruel words, despite the gnawing insecurity that plagued her, Clementine found herself standing at the edge of something she couldn't turn away from. The dress, carefully hidden from her family's sight, was her only companion as she prepared for the night ahead. Mrs. Carson had lent her an old pair of black shoes, scuffed but serviceable, and even offered to style her hair, pulling it back into a simple yet elegant updo. As evening fell, Clementine stood in front of the bakery, where Mrs. Carson had arranged for her to be picked up by a car. The vehicle, a sleek black sedan that gleamed under the fading sunlight, was more luxurious than anything Clementine had ever seen up close. As the driver opened the door for her, she hesitated for just a moment, her heart racing. This was it. This was her chance to escape, even if only for a few hours, into a world where she wasn't the poor girl from a broken family. With a deep breath, she stepped inside, the car's plush interior swallowing her whole. The ride to the gala felt like a dream. Clementine watched as the familiar streets of her small town gave way to the sprawling estates and grand buildings she had only ever glimpsed from a distance. Her mind raced with a mixture of excitement and terror. What if Griselda was right? What if she made a fool of herself? What if they all saw through her, saw her for the imposter she truly was? But it was too late to turn back now. The gala was being held at one of the largest estates in the region, a grand mansion with marble columns and sprawling gardens that seemed to go on forever. The entrance was already bustling with elegantly dressed men and women, their laughter and conversation filling the air with an energy that was both intoxicating and intimidating. Clementine had never seen anything like it. As she stepped out of the car, her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. She kept her head down, avoiding the curious gazes of the other attendees as she made her way toward the entrance. The emerald gown felt heavier now, like a burden rather than a blessing, and Clementine found herself wishing she could disappear into the crowd. But there was no turning back. Not now. A servant at the door took her ticket, his expression betraying no surprise or judgment as he waved her inside. Clementine stepped into the grand ballroom, and for a moment, the world stopped. The room was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, casting a warm, golden light over the polished marble floors. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and delicate flowers arranged in towering displays along the walls. Everywhere she looked, there were people, beautiful, wealthy people, dressed in gowns and suits that shimmered under the soft glow of the chandeliers. It was a world so far removed from her own that it felt like stepping into a different universe. Clementine felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She didn't belong here. She was an intruder in a world she didn't understand, surrounded by people who would never see her as anything more than the poor girl in a borrowed dress. But then, something extraordinary happened. As she stood frozen in the entrance, unsure of where to go or what to do, a figure appeared in the crowd, making their way toward her with purpose. Clementine's breath caught in her throat as she realized that this person, this man, was looking directly at her. And as he approached, her heart pounded in her chest, not with fear, but with something entirely new. The mansion was silent as Clementine sat in her private wing, staring out at the darkened gardens. The wind howled against the windows, and the moon cast long shadows over the grounds, adding to the foreboding air that had settled over her. She was now a millionaire's wife, living in a world so far removed from her former life that it often felt unreal. And yet, in the quiet of this night, the stark loneliness of her existence pressed down on her like an unbearable weight. Clementine had married wealth, but she had not married happiness. The beginning of her life with Adrian Lancaster had been a whirlwind, full of passion, luxury, and the thrill of a new world opening before her. After that fateful night at the gala, Adrian had pursued her with an intensity that left her breathless. His wealth, his charm, his seemingly boundless generosity had captivated her. It was a dream, one that seemed to sweep her off her feet, far from the darkness of her past. They had married within a year, with a ceremony so lavish that it was the talk of the entire region for months. Clementine, dressed in a gown that cost more than she had ever thought possible, had felt like a princess. The newspapers had called it a fairy tale romance, the story of the millionaire and the poor girl from the outskirts of town. But fairy tales, as Clementine had learned long ago, were not real. The gilded edges of her new life had quickly begun to tarnish, revealing a harsh reality that she hadn't anticipated. Clementine's marriage to Adrian had been a transition from one kind of prison to another. In the Tarrant household, she had been trapped by poverty, suffocating under the cruelty of her family. In Adrian's world, the bars of her cage were made of gold, but they were no less confining. Adrian, the charming, confident man she had fallen in love with, had changed as soon as they were married. The warmth and generosity he had shown her during their courtship had cooled, replaced by a distant, often controlling demeanor. His love for her, once so intense, now felt like possession. Adrian had an image to uphold, and Clementine had become a part of that image, a trophy to be displayed at dinners, galas, and charity events, but never truly loved or cared for. At first, Clementine had tried to adapt. She had told herself that perhaps this was simply the way of the wealthy, that the coldness, the formality of their interactions, was just how things were in this world. She had never known what a real marriage looked like, after all. But as the months turned into years, the isolation began to wear on her. Adrian's presence in her life grew more sporadic. He was constantly traveling for business, attending meetings and networking with other elites. Clementine, left behind in their sprawling mansion, began to realize just how little of her husband she truly knew. He had swept her into this life so quickly, so forcefully, that she had never had the chance to understand the man beneath the surface. Adrian Lancaster, the millionaire, the powerful businessman, had been a mystery from the start. And now, as Clementine sat alone in the mansion, she could feel that mystery unraveling. The servants, the house, the endless luxury, all of it began to feel like a facade, a shimmering veil hiding something much darker beneath. It wasn't long before Clementine began to hear whispers. At first, they were subtle, fragments of conversation overheard between the staff or offhand comments made by guests at their dinner parties. But soon, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Clementine couldn't ignore them any longer. There were rumors about Adrian, about his business dealings, his associations with questionable figures, and, most disturbingly, his involvement in certain shady enterprises that stretched beyond the surface of the clean, sophisticated world he projected. Clementine's unease grew as she began to investigate on her own. She searched through Adrian's private study, rifling through drawers and documents when he wasn't home, trying to piece together the truth about the man she had married. What she found was both shocking and terrifying. Adrian's wealth wasn't built solely on legitimate business ventures. Much of it was tied to underhanded deals, manipulation, and worse. He had ties to men who operated outside the law, men who used their money and influence to control entire sectors of the economy, the political sphere, and even the legal system. Adrian, the charming man who had rescued her from poverty, was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But the most devastating discovery came when she found out that her marriage had been part of a calculated move. Adrian hadn't just fallen in love with her. He had chosen her because she was easy to control, someone who would never question him or challenge his authority. Her background, her poverty, made her the perfect target. Clementine, the poor girl from nowhere, had been a pawn in Adrian's grander schemes from the very beginning. The love she had believed in was a lie. Clementine's heart raced as she sat in Adrian's study one night. The evidence of his lies spread out before her. She knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. She couldn't continue living in this gilded cage, pretending everything was perfect while the truth gnawed at her from within. When Adrian returned that night, she was ready. The tension between them was palpable as he walked into the study, his face betraying none of the warmth or affection that had once drawn her to him. He was composed, almost too calm, as if he had known this moment would come eventually. "We need to talk," Clementine said, her voice steadier than she expected. She gestured to the papers spread across his desk, the incriminating documents she had found detailing his secret dealings. Adrian's eyes flickered over the evidence, but his expression didn't change. He sighed, almost as if he were bored. "Clementine, what is this?" "You know exactly what it is," she said, her anger rising. "I know what you've been doing. The lies, the manipulation. You never loved me. You just needed someone you could control. Someone who wouldn't question you." Adrian raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a cold smile. "And what exactly are you planning to do with this information?" The calmness in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't even angry. He was simply amused. "I'll leave," Clementine said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain strong. "I'll expose you. The world will know what you really are." Adrian's smile widened, and he took a step toward her, his presence suddenly overwhelming. "Expose me? And what do you think that will accomplish, Clementine? Do you think anyone would believe you? You, the poor little girl who I pulled out of the gutter? You forgot, Clementine. I own this world. The people I do business with, they control everything. The law, the media, the politicians. You wouldn't stand a chance." For the first time since she had married him, Clementine saw Adrian for who he truly was. The charming facade was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating man who had built his empire on deceit and manipulation. He wasn't just wealthy, he was dangerous. And now she realized he wouldn't let her go so easily. "Besides," he added, his voice softening in a way that made her skin crawl, "you're mine, Clementine. You always have been, and you always will be." Clementine's world spun around her as she processed Adrian's words. She had been naive, thinking she could simply walk away from a man like him. He had trapped her, just as surely as her family had, and now she was facing a new kind of prison, one made of power and fear. But something inside her refused to give in. The flame of defiance that had kept her going through years of hardship, the same fire that had driven her to survive her family's cruelty, burned bright within her once again. She couldn't let Adrian win. She wouldn't. That night, Clementine made a decision. She would leave, but not in the way Adrian expected. She would find a way out, even if it meant walking into the unknown with nothing but her own strength. She would gather the few people she could trust, if any remained in this world, and plan her escape. But deep down, she knew that leaving Adrian wouldn't be easy. He would come after her. He would use his power, his connections, to hunt her down. And when he did, she would have to be ready, because in this game of betrayal and power, there was no turning back. Clementine was about to enter the fight of her life. The mansion stood quiet and still, an imposing structure of stone and glass that towered over the surrounding landscape. Inside its walls, Clementine sat in her bedroom, staring at the reflection in the tall, ornate mirror. The woman looking back at her was not the same girl who had once dreamed of escaping the confines of her family's home. That girl was long gone, buried beneath layers of deception, fear, and bitterness. Clementine's hand trembled as she traced the outline of her face, wondering when she had become so hollow, so distant from the life she had once wanted. Her marriage to Adrian had been the key to a new world, a chance to escape poverty, to find love and acceptance. But the key had unlocked a different kind of prison, one gilded with wealth and power, but suffocating all the same. Tonight, the house felt emptier than ever. Adrian was away on one of his many business trips, though Clementine suspected now more than ever that his business involved far darker dealings than he had ever let on. But even his absence offered no comfort. His presence loomed everywhere, in every corner of the mansion, in every room she wandered through aimlessly. His power, his control, was inescapable. Adrian had made sure she was trapped, and Clementine had finally begun to believe it. Clementine had spent weeks planning her escape, gathering what little resources she could without Adrian noticing. She had stashed away cash, hidden clothes in a secret compartment under the floorboards, and even forged a new identity in a desperate attempt to disappear. But no matter how carefully she planned, the crushing weight of Adrian's control always loomed. He was everywhere, even when he wasn't, his influence tightening around her like an invisible noose. The breaking point had come 2 nights ago when Clementine had attempted to flee. She had waited until the mansion was quiet, the servants asleep, and had slipped out into the night. But before she had made it to the edge of the grounds, a car pulled up, headlights cutting through the darkness. Adrian had stepped out. "Where were you going, Clementine?" he had asked, his voice dangerously soft. "You didn't really think you could leave me, did you?" He hadn't needed to raise his voice or make any threats. The power he wielded was so absolute, so crushing, that all he had to do was look at her, and she knew she was beaten. She had stood there, frozen in the moonlight, her hands trembling, her breath caught in her throat. And just like that, her last hope had crumbled. He had taken her back to the mansion, and in that moment, something inside her had finally snapped. There was no way out. Adrian had made sure of that. Every door was locked, every path blocked, and the world outside the mansion's gates was as much as it was anyone's. She would never escape, never be free of him. Now, 2 days later, Clementine sat in the quiet of her room. She had tried to fight, to survive, to find a way to live in a world that had always been so cruel. But now, it seemed like that fight had been for nothing. Clementine rose from the chair and walked slowly toward the window, her bare feet soundless against the cold marble floor. The night outside was dark, the stars barely visible through the heavy clouds that hung over the estate like a shroud. The wind whispered against the glass, and for a moment, Clementine imagined it was calling her, beckoning her toward some final, peaceful rest. Her mind drifted back to the life she had once known, the small, dilapidated house she had grown up in, her cruel father, indifferent mother, and hateful siblings. The long days of work, the quiet, secret dreams she had held on to for so long. She had escaped that life, hadn't she? She had found a way out, but what had it brought her? Nothing but another prison, one far more suffocating than the first. She thought of the people she had met in this world of wealth. Adrian's business associates, the sycophants who had surrounded her, pretending to care while keeping their distance. No one had ever truly seen her, not in the Tarrant household, not in the Lancaster mansion. She was always invisible, a vessel for other people's desires and expectations, never allowed to live for herself. Clementine let out a long, shuddering breath, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had lost, everything she had never had. She turned away from the window, her gaze settling on the small drawer by the bed where Adrian kept his personal belongings, things he thought she didn't know about. With trembling hands, she opened the drawer and pulled out the small vial of pills. She had seen them before, sleep aids, Adrian had called them, for when his work kept him up late into the night. But Clementine knew better. She knew how powerful they were, how easy it would be to take just a few too many and slip quietly into a sleep she would never wake from. She held the vial in her hands for a long time, the cool glass a stark contrast to the heat of her skin. Clementine sat on the edge of the bed, staring down at the vial in her hand. The decision before her felt both impossible and inevitable. She had tried to escape, but every path had led her back here, to this moment. She had fought for so long, endured so much, but now she was simply tired. Tired of the lies, the betrayals, the endless games that had stripped her of her identity, her will to live. She had wanted so much to be loved, to belong, to find peace. but that world had always been out of reach. Clementine unscrewed the cap of the vial. She tipped the pills into her palm, her eyes fixed on them as if they held the answers to all the questions that had haunted her for so long. In a way, they did. This was her way out, the only way out. With a deep breath, Clementine swallowed the pills one by one, the bitterness coating her tongue. She lay back on the bed, pulling the covers up to her chin as if preparing for sleep. The darkness was already closing in around her, soft and comforting, like the embrace of a long-lost friend. Her eyes fluttered shut, her body growing heavy, her thoughts drifting away like leaves on the wind. In those final moments, Clementine felt something close to peace, a quiet, final surrender. As the world faded away, the last thing she heard was the sound of the wind whispering through the trees, carrying her away into the unknown. And then there was silence. Clementine had spent her life trying to escape the cruel hands of fate, but in the end, it had claimed her all the same. Her story, like so many others, was one of quiet suffering, of a battle fought alone and unseen. But now, at last, she was free. In the cold, empty halls of the mansion, her absence would go unnoticed for a time. But eventually, Adrian would return, and he would find her, still and peaceful, beyond his reach. The world would move on, as it always did, but Clementine's story had reached its end. The storm had finally passed.